Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that will work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable coaching to learn more.
Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Jess Klek. She's the CRO over at Brighthire. We are going to talk culture. We're going to talk hiring. She's someone who has managed both big teams, bigger companies, smaller teams at fast-growing startups. We're going to get into kind of the origin of her superpower around creating culture. I've probably talked about this a number of times on the podcast, but I feel like I'm in this weird spot of having been in sales for a long time, but only have ever been a sales manager of like one or two AEs at a time, a couple of SDRs. I've never had my full-time focus on just running a sales team of any significance. I have technically been a sales manager, but that's a very, very different story. So I'm really excited to talk about, the piece that we're going to get to probably about 30 minutes in is around what are the things you can do to drive a winning culture, or a culture of winning and support within a team, which I think is such a delicate balance. But anyway, Jess, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Collin. Excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Like I said, this is like, I see it as a little bit of a gap of mine, and having never been that like full-time sales, I've got a lot of this knowledge from like my AE time, but maybe there's like a self-limiting belief of like, oh, I've never been a true sales manager. So I always love individuals like yourself that have run big teams, that have run small teams, that have gone small to big, big to small. So that's what I'm most excited about today.
Great. I'm excited to share. Hopefully we can both learn from one another today and share some good things out there.
I love it. We're talking, we started the pre-interview, we were talking about culture, and it was one of the precursors was almost, fair enough, is hiring and making sure you're hiring the right person. Before we get into kind of the details, I'm curious, how did you get to, seeing hiring and the importance of kind of building sales teams that go to battle for you? How did you get to these ideas as being kind of two of the most important ones to you?
I think experience over time. As a hiring manager, I have made both really excellent hires, but I've also made really poor hires. And interestingly enough, Quota Signal did a study that said the single biggest ARR killer is actually mishires, not process or anything else. And I can attest to that. I know intimately what it means to make some poor hires and how that affects and impacts the business. I'm also intimately aware of, like, as a first-time hiring manager back many years ago, no one taught me how to interview or how to hire. And that's still crazily like widespread today. Practice is that interviewing and hiring sort of happens in this black box, which, funnily enough, is why I ended up at Brighthire, because we, shine a light on that black box. But it's arguably the most important thing that you do in an organization as you think about big picture, right? Organizations are driven by strategy. People drive that strategy. And how do you get people? You hire them. And ultimately, it comes down to interviewing. And so just really through experience, I've learned that there's nothing more important as a hiring manager or people leader than hiring great people and having a process and a point of view on how to do that.
Totally. There's nothing worse than having like something that's a rep that's doing, that could do well, but they're not because you mishired on the culture piece.
Yeah.
Which I've totally never done before.
Me either. Yeah, I've totally never hired someone just got on gut feeling and a few minute conversation. I've definitely done that as well. Yeah, it's that right balance of, are they going to be the right individual for the role and the expectations and the impact for the business, but are they also going to be a cultural fit, and are they going to elevate the team and up level the team? And I think when you have high performing teams, they often have the best culture as well. So I tend to, as a leader, really double down on both facets of that, just great talent and great culture.
This is that sort of, the four quadrants of like, high performance, shitty culture, high performance, high culture, low performance, low culture. That is, I thought I was in one, turns out I was in the other at a certain point in time. What is maybe just for somebody who hasn't been in a high performance, shitty culture role, can you talk to me about like what that looked like, what that felt like? And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I still have PTSD from it. I'm sure a lot of people out there can relate. I won't name names here, but what that looks like is an environment in which, it is just ARR and results at all costs. And you are a cog in a wheel there for one singular purpose, to drive revenue or to drive, renewals or to drive demos, whatever your role is in an organization. But at the end of the day, you don't leave that organization feeling like you're a human or you're cared about, or, you've developed these deep sort of sense of loyalty to the company because you realize and recognize what you are there. And there are companies that have succeeded being, multi-billion-dollar organizations driving this type of high-performance, shitty culture environments. On the flip side, I've also, and this is personal experience for both of these examples, I've also worked for a low-performance, high-culture environment, which, it's hard to say which is better. It's like the lesser of two evils. I almost over-index on like the high-performance, shitty culture because it is incredibly frustrating as a high-achieving, high-performing individual to not be met with that in the environment of the organization. It's just so over-index on, the lunches that are being served and the ping pong tables and, the quiet rooms. And at the end of the day, when you try and put somebody on a plan for selling absolutely $0 and you are met with, that's really not kind, it was an incredibly frustrating experience. And so, I've had the luxury of learning from both of those environments. And, what I circle back to what I just said around, I really over-index on both high performance and high culture. And I find that when you hire for those two attributes, you end up creating the best team that drives the best results.
And I want to double click on that in a minute, but maybe I think a detour into why start with hiring first, and then we can get into how do you balance that high performance, high culture. Because I as well have been guilty of both being maybe too soft and too hard here at PR. I think we started off way too soft, Vancouver-based, bootstrapped, especially in the early days when you can't afford to pay huge salaries, you've got to over-index on, it's a fun place to work. There's a keg, there's a rooftop, we do all these like parties and things. And then suddenly that becomes the focal point of this is why an individual is showing up. And so it can be tough. I've also done on the opposite side where you've got SDRs, you're saying, hey, your job is to serve the customer, your job is to, the customer is the AE, your job is to book meetings, especially being a remote, it's really challenging to maintain that culture. And so I'm keen to double click on that. Before we do, let's do a little detour into hiring. Why does this process start with hiring?
Yeah, as I mentioned, hiring is the single most important thing you do as a people leader, and arguably the most important thing any company does, because to execute on that strategy, you need people. And as a lot of first-time managers or hiring managers, there isn't a training program for how to hire, right? No one, when you step into leadership, it's like, okay, now you're leading people, like go hire a team. And oftentimes you partner with your talent acquisition team and, there's generally been some guidance there, but they're ultimately relying on the hiring manager to direct, here's what I'm looking for, here's the attributes I'm testing for, but they haven't been properly trained. And so that really stuck out to me after, making some bad hires, is that, wow, this is not just I get to hire people as a manager. This is actually the most important thing I can do to set my team up and myself up and the company up for success. And when you have a culture and an organization that buys into that and believes that hiring is the most important thing, then that's where you really like the rubber meets the road, and you start to develop planning around hiring, and you start to develop standardization and process, and you start to see that the results reflected of that with less attrition and less mishire and more faster ramp, right? So when you really focus on the hiring process and what happens in that interview, I think it really allows you to over-index on building an exceptionally high-performing team.
I totally agree. I'm curious. Curious if you can talk to me about your hiring process and what that process looks like, and maybe who's involved. I know in some companies they'll have larger organizations, or that'll be in larger organizations, they'll have the support of recruiting. I find it's way too easy, especially in a larger company, to just rely on your recruiting function or your HR function to, find, source, and make the hire. I'm curious, how do you, talk to me about your process and where kind of recruiting and HR's role is.
Sure. I think they play a big role in the sense that they're there from a hiring manager's perspective to be a resource, but everything starts with having a plan. And I was introduced to this theory of a standardized interview guide by one of my mentors and friends, Sean Murray, current CRO of Greenhouse. Absolutely phenomenal people leader. When we were scaling out SalesLoft, we were hiring like crazy. And I mean, I think my peer and I spent probably 20 hours a week doing interviews and hiring. And Sean rolled out this standardized process of asking every candidate for the role the same series of questions. And at first it felt really foreign and it felt really forced. Like, hey, I just kind of want to get to know these people. I know what I'm testing for. But what I realized is that, there was probably some bias, in my interview process because I am who I am. And without, trying to interject the bias, it was just sort of naturally there. And by asking these standardized questions, it became a much more equitable process for all of the candidates, but it also gave me a different view of the candidate because they were all answering the same question, and I got to hear how they answered it differently and how that influenced my opinion of that and how it influenced, whether or not I wanted to move forward with them. So it started with this sort of standardization of a plan, right? We're planning the interview. These are the questions we're going to ask. And then, do you mind if
I double click on that? Because I think this is such an important piece that I suspect there could be some people listening go, well, I don't have bias. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you were biased against hiring a particular demographic. Like, I'm going to come into an interview. I'm going to be biased towards people that have, maybe similar experience. I'm going to be biased towards people that have worked at companies that I know. I'm going to have biases. They're not necessarily the DEI biases, or diversity, equity, inclusion. Okay.
Yeah, you got it.
DEI biases that might be top of mind. They're going to be biases that you're not really thinking of as like, oh, these are ones I have to watch out for.
Yeah.
I wanted to double click here because one of the advantages of a process like this, because I've gone through freewheeling it and hired a bunch of guys that look like Collin, which was terrible. I mean, it wasn't bad. Those guys were great, but having a very homogeneous population as your first, 5 hires, not a good idea. The thing that I noticed when I was going through this, we did a very similar exercise, is that people are progressing that are surprising you. That you're like, wow, I wouldn't have, my natural way of hiring wouldn't have picked this up. I wouldn't have put this person through to the next round. Was it a similar experience for you?
Absolutely. And it's that unconscious bias that we are unconsciously interjecting into the process. Whereas when you're asking these, standardized questions, like you said, you're eliciting different responses that you might not have elicited by asking a question that you normally ask, or what you feel comfortable with, or what you think is the right question to ask. That's one of the main drivers that we care about at the company I work for now, which is uncovering those unconscious biases in the interview and surfacing that data to the hiring manager. Like, for instance, with Eng, this happens a lot where when we actually did a study on this, when male interviewers interviewed female candidates, they asked them 25% less questions. So, and that was, not, again, that's unconscious bias. But if you think about that over time and extrapolate that, there were so many incredible female engineers that were not getting hired because they were asked fewer questions. And again, to bring it back to the DEI and just like the unconscious bias of a regular hiring manager, they don't mean to, right? But it's just their predisposition. And so, yeah, having that list of standardized questions really drives diverse points of view and moves them forward in the process faster, because you're like, wow, I would have never asked that question before. And the answer I just got is really like illuminating.
Especially when it's your 6th interview of the day. And like,
Yeah.
I can freewheel an interview for like 1 or 2, but if you're spending half of your week, like literally 20 hours a week in interviews, being consistent with if you don't have a process, a set list of questions is impossible. At least for me, I couldn't do it. Every interview did end up totally different.
Yeah. Same for me. And I think also, as we think about like sort of the evolution of that process, where we took it from there was this standardized, list of questions, short list from there. And then I'm a big believer of cross-functional buy-in. And so sort of that next step in the process is identifying key individuals that work cross-functionally that you want sort of their buy-in on this hire. And that may look like another peer, that may look like a peer manager or leader, a cross-functional partner they may work with. We try and keep the interview loop under 4 because there's sort of like diminishing returns. In between 4 and 8, we actually see a 50% increase in mishire the more interviews you have, which is really interesting. But it's just because there's the candidate withdrawal rate also increases as you think about, and you've probably had this experience. I have too. I have interviewed for roles that I've had 20 plus interviews. And by the end of the interview, I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been asked the same questions hundreds of times. That information is not being shared. And so it's just a candidate experience. So you miss out on great hires, which is why part of this evolution of my hiring process has been the standardization, 1 or 2 peer interviews or cross-functional interviews, alignment at the exec level, and then ultimately driving to the hire. And part of that cross-functional is a actual cultural aptitude, which it's like people that aren't going to be directly interacting with this individual, testing for sort of like, how do they live up to the company's values and the mission? And how do they articulate how they can sort of fit in, which I find is equally as important as that standardized list of sort of aptitude behavioral questions. Because again, you could have someone that high aptitude, high performing, but if they're not a cultural fit, then that's just going to bring the team down. And again, result in just not great results ultimately.
Totally. You brought an interesting point. I have definitely tried with more people, and I've also settled on a few. I'm kind of in the like, currently it's myself and 2 others, depending on the role. The more senior, the more broad we generally go because the more people are going to interact with. But if it's an AE, SDR, it's like 1 or 2, 3 people. The number of steps and time it takes. I'm curious, with this process, it does add overhead. Ultimately, it does increase the quality of the process. But can you talk to me about the overhead that it does add, or the amount of time it does take to run somebody through your standard process?
Ultimately, we try and cap like the number of interviews. Scheduling's always an issue, right? Like on the candidate side and internally. I think we try, knowing all of the data that we have in our company, we certainly try to move the candidate through the process as fast as humanly possible. And we sort of have, that's like a cultural alignment for us at Brighthire, is when we are hiring someone, that is a priority. But I think there's a lot of companies that don't align on hiring as the ultimate priority. And so you're subject to waiting, this manager can't meet until Tuesday. And then we have, this scheduling issue, and then the candidate's on vacation that day. And so you're running out like a 2-3 week process, where we try to keep it like under 2 weeks. I think anything over that, is okay if that happens, but theoretically speaking, you want to keep it relatively quick to reduce the opportunity for the candidate to withdraw. And even though we are in these macroeconomic conditions we are in, there's still a war for talent. There always will be, right? There's a lot of people on the market, but they're not necessarily the best high performing, high cultural individual that you want to hire. So when you find someone good, you want to run them through your process really, really quickly and get them hired.
Totally. I'm curious, after each interview ends, how do you collect the people's answers about the different questions they asked? Do you have a scorecard? Do you have a note-taking standardized? What does that look like?
Yes. Well, we are very spoiled at Brighthire because that is, in fact, what we do. And so for us, Brighthire joins our interview, and we record, transcribe, and we use artificial intelligence to auto summarize what happens. And so I don't even take a single note on my interview. I just have my interview guide. I ask my questions. I know it's being recorded, and the AI is taking the notes up to 100% accuracy. It's 99.99. And then those notes are seamlessly integrated into Greenhouse, which is our ETS. And so
Cool.
you can collaborate immediately on that feedback in the scorecard. And it's a one-click submittal. So that is why we're able to decrease the number of interviews in that interview loop, because we are able to calibrate on feedback faster, share clips as well. So when I look at all of the answers, I can say oh, hey, Ben, take a look at this candidate, what they said about this particular attribute, or, how they answered this question. And that just reduces the amount of time and drives a much more efficient process for us. Because note-taking, it is incredibly important during an interview. It doesn't always happen. The feedback doesn't always get into the system. And so that's where the black box of hiring happens. So you're like, what happened? I don't know. And then, you forget everything that just happened because you're on to the next meeting. And by the time you go to fill out the scorecard, you're just doing the thumbs up or thumbs down with zero context for the next interviewer.
Mm-hmm. We had to establish, we used an old school Google form, and we had to establish no talking about the candidate rule until you've submitted your form. Because it defeats the purpose of having the scorecard if you're just going to talk about it and then group think on the candidate. Oh, I like them. Oh, well, I saw this and that. It's okay, now everybody's scorecards are the same.
Right. Absolutely. And that entire process is filled with unconscious bias, right? Because you're not actually hearing directly from the candidate. So good that you had a process. I love the no talk about candidate rule until you fill out your feedback. Because at least you were thinking about some sort of standardization there.
100%. Yeah, we had we borrowed from the Who process, or the Who method, and then EOS has a quarterly review process. So we stole a little bit from that, which was, I think the short version was culture fit, role fit, gets it once it has the capacity to do it. And so, I don't know, I think it was just culture fit and then gets it once it has the capacity. It was those you score them on the 4 things and your 4 elements of culture, and then gets it once it has the capacity, and GWC. And that was such a great shortcut. I'm curious, how do you come up with a profile of an individual you're hiring? Or do you have magic AI for this too?
I'm sure we do, and I don't even know about it. We ship stuff so fast. I think truly today, when it comes to a profile, I think it starts with the job description. So you kind of work backwards into it. So what am I looking for in this role? What are the most important things this person needs to accomplish? What's the type of experience that they need to have to be successful? And Clue, you can absolutely take a job description, put it in Chat GPT, and have them like rewrite it for you. A lot of AI tools to help. I think once we sort of align on the job description, then in the past, I've looked at what are some of the behavioral characteristics that make up someone that would be successful in this role. They have to be autonomous, they have to be agile, they have to be able to work in ever-changing environments and be able to pivot. So I kind of boil it down to like particular behavioral traits after we understand sort of like what's just baseline to be able to be successful. And then we take a look at the sort of like the cultural aspects, right? Like, is this person, how are they like, how could we tie this to intrinsic motivation? Are they people that need to be coached and loved? Are they empathetic? You need kind of like create this list of ideal traits. And ultimately, I look at the individuals that are successful on my team and say, like, what are the things that make them so successful? And I kind of marry those two things together and say, like, this is the profile of the individual that will be successful here.
And then how does that profile, does that fit into your scoring mechanism, or is it just sort of something that you review or that feeds into the job description? Like, how do you actually use the profile?
Yeah, both. I mean, we build questions around the profile for the interview guide. Yeah. So we take all of those things.
Connected.
Yeah. So you take the job description, you align on the ideal profile, you build your interview questions from there, and then that's how you test the candidates against them.
I feel like I just asked the dumbest question because I'm like, I don't get how it connects. But
that was not a dumb question. That was a great question. Yeah.
We'll go with that. Sure. Just me pushing around trying to understand. I love the hiring process. It was an accidental product placement. Handy that you. I wasn't trying to cue you up there, but
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Anytime I get a 30% commission, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Checks in the mail.
Awesome. Sounds great. So once we've got the hiring process nailed, we understand our hire, like who it is that we are trying to hire. We have a strong process for actually putting rubber to the road and hiring that individual, teams together. So once they're on board, what are the things we can do to drive that culture of winning?
Yeah. I love this question because it's something I'm really passionate about. And over the years, I've sort of honed my leadership style to be kind of an amalgamation of like servant leadership, oversharer. I do think one of the things that has really served me well has been the transparency and the over communication. I have been part of teams and on teams where everything has felt like a surprise, and no one likes surprises, especially when it relates to their job or relates to, how they're making money. And so I have really come from a place of empathy and saying, like, if I were in their shoes, would they want to know this? And of course, I'm not crossing any integrity lines and sharing things that I can't or shouldn't share, but to push it all the way to the gray is where I go, because I feel like that has served me well in building trust and credibility and authenticity with my teams. And so, yeah, one thing is I overshare. And I think the other thing is.
Do you mind if I ask if you could share a time? And I'm intentionally using the STAR method on you.
Love it.
Can you tell me about a time where you were hyper transparent or overshared in the workplace?
Yeah. I mean, I do it all the time. I think most importantly, one of the examples I think the most poignant was during COVID. And there was so much uncertainty in what was happening with everybody's jobs. And to the point in which I could share, like, we knew a RIF was coming, and I didn't want anyone on my team to feel scared or upset. And so shared that a RIF was coming and to prepare, and we had no idea who was going to be in it. I detailed for them the process before it was sort of ruled out, which, we had the okay to share. But I shared as much as I could with them to make them feel comfortable and be prepared for that moment, because I didn't want anyone to be surprised. I am like fundamentally against the succession model of just like pulling people up on a Zoom and wishing them well and popping off. Though I understand, like in some circumstances, that is necessary. But in that time, it was just such a brutal time for everybody. I just couldn't bear to not share as much as I possibly could with my team about what was happening.
Totally. And I think to your point earlier about no surprises,
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could talk to me about the role of, leadership, or maybe talk to me about your role in kind of fostering that environment of high culture, high performance.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about what it looks like. What are the things that you actually do, especially in a remote world where it's like you can't just go up to the rooftop and have a beer or, catch somebody in between calls and check in on them?
Yeah. One thing I will say that I have to my advantage is I have hired some of the same folks over and over and over again. And there is, for me, that luxury of knowing these individuals, how we sell together, how they like to be managed. So we sort of have that going for us. But for the new folks that I hire, I really truly believe it begins with credibility. And so it's never mattered what role I've been, whether I've been a frontline leader or I've been leading leaders or owning a business unit. I am never far away from the deal. And I'm never too good to be in a deal strategy session. I am never too high. I'm not an ivory tower leader. Like, I will get in there. I'll do disco calls with you. I mean, most recently, for the first time, I'm owning SDR, and I've been working with this team on pitch and objection handling and hooks and their cadences and adding steps and things that I have never done before. But I am in the trenches with them. So I'm trying to build that credibility that, I'm not too good to do the job alongside of them, and I will do the job alongside of them. I think the second piece that is just ultimately so, so important is allowing space to give your team to fail fast and fail forward. I've worked for leaders that accept zero mistakes, that are condescending, that don't have a place for failure or learnings. And for me, being able to not always provide the right answers. Of course, I don't always have the right answers. Like, newsflash, leaders don't have all the answers, and we don't have to. Right? But I remind my team of that often. I don't have all the answers, guys. But I do allow space to fail forward, and to look back and learn. And I think,
You mean by failing forward?
yeah, I mean, I don't consider anything specifically in sales a failure. Even a closed lost deal is a learning opportunity. So what do you take from that, and how do you fail forward, right? Instead of getting too low in the low of losing a deal and we lost revenue. Okay, well, let's pick ourselves back up, dust our shoulders off. What did we learn? How are we going to push forward? How are we going to do things differently? That's different than someone just failing at a job because they're not competent or they're not putting forth the energy and effort. Like, failing forward comes with a high performing team, because especially for us, in a company that is creating a category, we are out there testing things all the time. And if we didn't have space to be able to fail forward, no one would want to do this job. And so I think that's really important. I think the other thing that goes hand in hand with failing forward is enablement, constant enablement, product enablement, pitch enablement, skill enablement. Some of the folks that have worked for me for the last 8 years, I mean, we are still figuring out ways to learn and do things better and to strategize. And so enablement is a key part of building that high performance and high cultural team, because they have a safe space to ask questions and they feel more apt to share with their colleagues and teammates instead of creating this sort of unnecessary internal conflict. I like healthy competition, but not at the expense of collaboration. And I think, lastly, it's like celebrate the wins, even the little ones, right? Like STRs getting a call, like booking a meeting, I will celebrate that like we just closed $1 million deal. It is hard out there. All of these jobs are incredibly difficult, and it is so important to not forget to celebrate the wins, especially in a remote environment. We actually have a channel in Slack that is specific for like lighting people up and like calling out good deeds, and like we call it bright lights. But it's a great opportunity in a remote environment to celebrate and, catch people doing things great and making sure they feel recognized and seen, which all adds to high performing culture.
Nice. We have a shout outs channel, but we also have a sassy replies channel. And that's probably my favorite.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that. What's the sassiest reply you've seen? Like, what's the best thing that's been in there?
One that happened to me was I was on a sales call and the guy was local entrepreneur, and he's like, Collin, I appreciate, that all, Jared uses you and all these people use you. He's like, I just don't think cold email works. And I was like, my friend, I'm not going to say his name. I was like, I know for a fact that I have handed you off to 3 different customers in the last year. He's like, no way. Like, pull it up. And like, sure enough, I'd booked 3 meetings off of this individual. That was my like, I was an AE, but like on a sales call, I think the most aggressive one we got was the guy took a picture of himself holding a bat and was like, that's all it was just like him holding like a baseball bat. And like, that was the reply.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's pretty sassy.
It's very sassy. But I think it just allows you to like make light of something that can be like a hard or a threatening moment. If you're an SDR and you get a crappy email like that, like it's a shitty thing to do to somebody. It's the least we can do is laugh at it.
It is. It is. And like for anyone out there listening, if you get a cold call, like what is the point in being an asshole? I mean, you literally can just say, sorry, not interested right now. I mean, we could go down a very dark rabbit hole here, which we won't, but yeah, I'll just leave it at the PSA. No one needs to be a jerk. Just say you're not interested. That's all.
Literally cost you less energy to be like, just neutral about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it, guys.
Yeah. There's one person who's a prominent part of the entrepreneur community in the area that I live in. And I cold outbounded to him once and he ripped me a new one for reaching out to him over LinkedIn. Like, how dare you? This is my professional network, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, this person has forever colored himself in my eyes. Like, I'll never be able to think positively of him because of this one interaction that he probably has no idea about.
Yeah, like, but also, does he know how LinkedIn works?
Yeah. It's like, dude, we're connected. I'm in your professional network. There's an inbox in here for a reason.
It's called an in-mail. That's what it's there for. Anyways,
it's just straight up a message. Yeah. I wanted to come back to the failing forward piece, especially when you're like, you've got a rep who's got a deal on the line.
Yeah.
You want to give them the space to screw it up. But also, so how do you strike the balance of like totally letting them, will you let a rep pooch the deal if you can see something and they don't see it? Or will you kind of gently guide them?
Oh, that's a tough one. Generally, I'm in most of the deals. But I will say if it is, depends on where, I guess, let me answer that question by qualifying it and saying it depends on the tenure of the rep and sort of like my confidence level in them. I think if it is a meaningful deal to the organization, then like the failing forward is letting them come to me with their strategy and saying, okay, let's see how it plays out. And if we don't get, the right feedback, then we'll come in and sort of like redirect. If it's a smaller deal that is what I call sort of like a learning opportunity, then yeah, I would let them go out there, try it, and they come back, they learn, guess what? They're not going to do that again because those are deals that, they've lost. That's commission they've lost out on. So it generally depends on the size of the deal. I think typically a more tenured rep wouldn't have like the type of questions a lesser tenured rep would have that needed the opportunity to fail forward more often. Like they've already done that. In the sense of a more tenured rep failing forward, it's more like process and like strategy, and like giving them the opportunity to sort of test some things versus me saying like, hey, I've seen this movie a million times. This is how it's going to play out. Let's do that. But so like doing it we do a bunch of deal reviews and we get, a bunch of the team together, even outside of sales, to kind of come in and offer support and differing points of view. And there, we'll really poke at the strategy. And oftentimes, like, that's where the failing forward happens is like, oh, yeah, I see now this is not going to work. And so, like, let's recalibrate. And then, like, that's what we'll go try out in the wild. But yeah, I mean, I want my teams to feel empowered to make their own decisions and drive forward, like, their own strategy. But also, we're paid to bring revenue into the company. So you got to strike a balance.
Totally. It kind of leads into the next piece, which is like the balance of like giving somebody the shot versus like cutting a local farmer. Like,
Yeah.
how do you make that decision? What feeds into that?
Yeah. A couple things. I mean, in SaaS, like, I think at minimum there is a 6-month runway of learning and ramp and like understanding the pitch, and especially in like a category created product. But even with more, mature products, I think 6 months is a good view into like, are they going to be successful? Have they gotten points? Have they put in some points on the board? Have they closed some deals? Do I think that I can identify enablement areas that, when I coach them, they put that into practice, right? Like if I teach them something or they learn something, are they putting it into practice right away? Are they iterating on it? Are they then, coaching up the rest of the team on it? Are they sharing and collaborating? I think that's one part. I think the other part is like, are they doing the work, right? Like, are they putting in the effort and making the cold calls and like, hitting their activity metrics out of the park, doing pipe gen? And is it just like a deal convert thing? So are they controlling what they can control? Do they have the aptitude to learn? And at the end of 6 months, if like those boxes are checked, then I generally will give them a little more runway. But if at the end of the 6 months, they haven't put in the effort, or I just don't see like that fire and they're sort of like phoning it in, yeah, they're a low performer. They got to go. On the flip side of that, I also have a no asshole policy, which it's like, you can be a top performer, but if you are a lone wolf, if you are hard to work with internally, if you're not collaborative, helpful, if you're not a culture fit, I will cut you just as fast as I'll cut a low performer that has all of the other things that's not hitting the number.
That's got to be a tough one.
It is. Often it's a very tough, sometimes it's tough for the business to understand that. But for me, I cannot risk that cancerous behavior spreading, because there are a lot of bad habits that go into that. And I never want to build a culture that you are the cog in the wheel. That individual will go to that company. High performing, shitty culture, they'll crush it. And companies like that are wildly successful in spite of that. But that's not the type of business or culture or organization I want to run.
Got it. It is somebody, I don't remember who said it. Somebody told me that culture is more about what you allow than the things that you do. And especially in a smaller team, allowing a couple of bad behaviors it has a way of kind of bleeding itself into the rest of the culture.
Absolutely. It's cancerous. Yeah. Especially in a small company. Yeah. I think the strongest move you can make as a leader is making a stand early on with bad behavior. It's like, fail forward. You're going to be an asshole. You failed forward. And the swift action I'm going to take is like, that's not allowed. Like, not here.
Totally. I remember somebody saying when I had an incident like this, and it was a friend of mine kind of holding up a mirror, and he's going, "You've told me about this before. So you're saying 1 in 4 is not a good fit because they're an asshole?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "So you're saying 25% of your sales team are assholes?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I see what you're saying."
Yeah, that's tough, but
The math gets bigger when you're a smaller team.
that's right. Yep, the math isn't math in there.
Totally. I do think the sort of sales development stuff is a podcast for another day, which I definitely would love to do if you're up for it.
Sure.
I want to land by talking about the difference between teams and families. I think a lot of people say culture means family. I would love to, I love my brothers. I love my sister-in-law. I 100% would have fired his last girlfriend. So how do you strike that balance? Because I wasn't able to fire my brother's last girlfriend.
Oh, yeah. This is like one of those things that it like stems up like inside, no, there is a no world in which work is family. Now, I say this with a team of people that I love dearly. I have been through the trenches with, hell and back for the last 8 years. And do I consider them family outside of work? I do. But you cannot conflate work and family as part of like your cultural sort of touchstone, because it is going to set you up for failure. There has to be space in between having high culture where it's empathetic, you deeply and truly and authentically care about one another, but you also have that space to have the tough conversations. And if it gets to the point, you have to be able to separate, and you have to be able to drive business decisions first and foremost, because that is what we're paid to do. But you can create an incredible culture that's not family. So I think instead of looking at it from a family perspective, you look at it from mutual respect, empathy, admiration, authenticity, and you build all of those things so that you can have those conversations around work, and you build the trust and the authenticity and the empathy in the work environment, right? And so, yeah, work is not family. I've been part of companies that family was actually like a value system, which presented so many issues. I think they've since changed it, but it artificially inflates something, and artificially puts the word family at the forefront of business, and you can't drive results with your family. You can't pick family, right? You're stuck with them. You can certainly pick who you work with, and you can coach them, and you can certainly, move them out of the business if you need to. So yeah, work is not family. I don't get paid to be with my family. I get paid to drive business impact and revenue for a company, and to build a great environment and culture where people want to take time away from their families, to do the work. And I think that's more important, is like, am I building a company that people feel good about leaving their families to come do? Because ultimately we spend so much of our time at work, and with these people, you want to care and love them and deeply connect. But at the end of the day, we want to like shut off the computer, go back to our family, because that's who we're doing this all for.
100%. And I like the analogy of like, I am not the team mom, team dad. I am the general manager. It is my job to make sure that I've got a roster. I got to fill that roster with the right people.
That's right.
That'd be a harsh view. You're like, sorry, son. Neil, your coloring wasn't very good. We're going to have to go a different direction.
I don't know. My 6-year-old has made quite a lot of appearances on my Zooms, and I'd put him in.
I'd put him in. I wouldn't put Neil in for coloring. I'd go with Joe for coloring, but he's a little more outside the lines, like his dad.
I like it.
Jess, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people are interested in the company and talking to you and talking about or working for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. But you can reach me at jess@brighthire.ai. Yeah, check us out. If you also agree that hiring is the most important thing that you're going to do as a leader or a company, then Brighthire is certainly a company for you.
Love it. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll see y'all next week.